I would imagine that I would be having feelings or thoughts of like, why did this happen? Like those kinds of things that just seem very like stereotypical questions that it feels like someone would go through. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Minds of Media. My name is Blake Panashevitz, and today's guest is one of the best investigative journalists involved in esports. He was the youngest journalist hired by ESPN. He won the 2018 Esports Award for Journalist of the Year and is one of my best friends. Please let me introduce Jacob Wolf. Welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad we're finally getting to do this. I feel like we talked about doing this for a while, and then like it was just like a timing thing and a bunch of other things, and like now we're actually doing it. So it's you caught me at a good time too, right before the League of Legends World Championship sprint comes. So I'm all about it.
I know. I'm super happy to get you on here. It's been in the talks for a while. Actually, probably since when I started doing these. You were one of the people I was like, hey, if we ever get time, can we do this? And it took a long time. So I'm really excited. I'm also excited because I think there's things about you that I know just because we're friends that we can like talk about, and things growing up with your life that I don't think a lot of people really know about, that it's going to be kind of a tell-all about you as a person. Because I don't think people know actually a lot about who is Jacob Wolf, because you always focus so much on your work, and your work is not about telling about Jacob Wolf. It's about breaking the news or telling stories about other things, which I think is a really interesting concept to kind of go into. So we're going to start it off slightly easy with the questions, then we'll move into some harder ones. So one of the first ones, I don't know if a lot of people know this about you. You are you used to be really big into music, and probably still are big into music, but you used to be in a choir, actually, that is like a semi-famous choir that used to travel. You didn't stay in it very long, but you did do singing, and it was actually hard to get into this choir I heard of. So how important is like singing and performing to you? Is that still something that you do?
Yeah. So honestly, like confidence is probably built. My confidence, and I'm a very confident person, was probably built through being a performer at some point, right? Like, so for me, like my grandmother was super big into music from as young as I can remember. Some of my earliest memories are like being in her house in this like small town outside of Atlanta, playing piano, and like her playing piano, her teaching me, her taking me to lessons. And she taught me how to sing from a really early age. I mean, like as soon as I could like 3 or 4 years old, like as soon as I could start comprehending like how to put together a sentence, like she was on top of me to like learn how to sing. And I loved it. Like I love it. It's a great form of art and expression. I remember pretty fondly actually that, and I know like people will be politically split on this now, but back, I want to say I was like 4 or 5 years old. It was Sonny Perdue's Georgia governor election campaign, and he had an election bet in our area, and I sang the national anthem at that as a child.
Wow.
And so like to sort of, like to put into perspective, like this has been a big part of my life forever. And when I got into middle school, my grandmother, like I signed up for like guitar classes. I didn't own a guitar, or at least my mom had one, but it was kind of messed up. My grandmother took me to a music shop and bought me a brand new one, and like was such a big like person, that was on top of me for doing this, and not in a way that was like anyone pushy. I enjoyed doing it, and I wanted to learn how to be a musician. And it was kind of my life stream for a long time. So for me, like the choir aspect of that, the choir that I was a part of was the Atlanta Boy Choir, which is a touring choir based in downtown Atlanta in Ponce de Leon. And I auditioned for it, I want to say when I was 11 or 12 years old. Actually a lot older than a lot of the boys that were in that choir. Usually many of them get in around 8 or 9. My younger brother actually also got in how old was my younger brother when he got in? My younger brother was like 6, because he was in there like I think I was 13 when he got in. He came in a few years after I did. He was in there like little, like they used to do like opening performances with the little kids. He was a part of that, and then eventually like worked his way through it to get to like the second highest tier, because they had like 4 or 5 different boy choirs. But I started there because we couldn't afford to do all the traveling. I started in like the second tier choir, and then by the end of that like season or whatever, like I was they wanted me in the first one in the first place, the like touring choir right off the bat. I just couldn't afford it. And so I was in the big part of the touring choir, and we did a tour of Alaska
Wow.
And it was really cool. I at that point like hadn't been any further north in the United States than I think Missouri at that point, like where my grandfather lived, and no further west than Mississippi. So like that was to go to Alaska was like a really far away experience, and like fly from Atlanta to Phoenix to Anchorage. We got there like right before the solstice change too. So I remember like distinctly that like when we got there, it was like mega dark. I remember I got there a little bit early because I flew. By that point, by the time we toured, they were trying to create this program for like the boys who voices were dropping and all of us couldn't sing anymore, like at the really high pitch. Because like when I first got in, I was a soprano, and by the time I left, I was a baritone. It was just like huge vocal shift, right? Because I was going through puberty and everything else. And they were creating this program, and to like basically because we were the more mature ones, 13, 14, 14 years old, they essentially like made this buffer where we would like become leaders, and then eventually we had our own choir the following season that performed with the men's choir, but also like mentored some of the boys that were younger than us. And so I went a little bit early with some of the adults to essentially like check in and make sure everything was okay. I was going to be responsible for a certain number of boys in our like dorms. We were staying, I believe, at the University of Anchorage, if I remember correctly. And so like we were staying in their dorms because they weren't there because it was the summer. So all the students are home. And we ended up getting there, and it was like pitch black for days. And then like the solstice change hit, and then it was nothing but light. And it was like so difficult to sleep. Like the time zone difference did not bother me, but like the fact that like it was constantly bright outside my window, no matter how much I turned those blinds, like I was screwed. That was really interesting. But yeah, I mean, like it was a good time. We got to touring that state. It was really awesome. We got to go around the whole state in a bus, and perform in a lot of big cities, small cities, for the span, I want to say like 14 days. It was almost 2 weeks.
That's really cool.
It was pretty close. And then came back home, and yeah, I mean, I like, doing that, back to my point about confidence, like doing that essentially like made me the confident person I am today, because music was certainly the first thing. Music was the first thing I felt that I was better than other people at. And in the sense that like I could be proud of that. Like it was something that was special about my character, being able to play guitar, being able to sing, you know, and so like it was a huge part of my life. When I was in middle school, I would always like perform at the we'd have like semi-annual twice a year, winter and summer, or spring concerts for our strings class or our guitar class, and I would always choose to sing and play, and that was just what I enjoyed doing. And then going into high school, actually, I ended up in, and I come from a fairly Protestant family, but I ended up in the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was a football player, so that's why I was there. I was recruited in by a senior. I was a freshman, and ended up being the worship leader by the time I left at the end of 10th grade. So I was leading worship every single day that we had it, which I think was twice a week, and was up there just performing. Like it is a huge part of my character. That eventually led me to doing some work in the music industry also, as I've originally wanted to be a producer. And I'm sure if I was patient now, I could be a better producer. I was certainly not patient as a 14 and 15-year-old. As a teenager, I was not patient at all. And so, but I did like have this like knack for business. My granddad was an entrepreneur. So he like helped me set up a business, and I ran a record label for a period of time, and then went into artist management. Did some stupid things as teenagers do in that scenario, and then ended up doing another record label, and then ended up doing a radio station, an online radio station. And I was actually doing the online radio station when I got into esports as a writer. At least I'd been a fan for long enough, paying attention. But yeah, so music kind of like got me here, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah. So I actually I have so many follow-up questions now, which is great. I like when people tell things that we get to do. So first of all, one of the things I think people will notice that is going to be very common with you is you talk a lot about your grandparents. Like those are the ones that you mostly go to. What's the story behind your grandparents? Tell me a little bit about them, because I actually don't know a whole ton about them.
Yeah, so my grandparents, my granddad is a World War II vet. He was in the Navy. Is born in 1940. No, 1927. Sorry, 1927. My grandmom's 1929, and my great uncle, who I also had a pretty close relationship with, is an Army veteran, and so my great uncle fought in Europe and was part of the Western push to push into Germany. And my grandfather was part of the island hopping campaign with the Navy in the Pacific to push into Japan. And so my granddad came back from war, and he it was also like, it came from a small Georgia family on a farm that like had like 7 kids, but basically no money. So like education was not of priority in that family because they just couldn't afford it. But because my great uncle and him both were veterans, they got GI Bill. And so they were able to go get educated and become educated. So my grandfather enrolled at the University of Georgia and there met my grandmother, who in a journalism class nonetheless, which is what they both ended up being. And neither of them became journalists, but they both studied journalism at least. And so my grandmother's her family is fascinating to me. My great grandfather essentially ran an oil company that got bought by Exxon.
Oh, wow.
Or no, got bought by Mobil, and is now we own Exxon Mobil stock because Exxon Mobil they merged. And so, and he went on to do a bunch of other things. I never got to meet him. He passed away before I was born. But like, it just very like classy guy, really gave back a lot too. And was a big part of my aunt and my mom's life as when they were children, and came to live with my grandparents eventually, and was around a lot more. And so my grandparents met once my grandmother graduated. They got married and ended up in 1950. So they have been together now 70 years as of this upcoming October, which is pretty crazy.
That's impressive.
My grandmother is 91 as of this past May. My grandfather is 93 as of this April. They've been a huge part of my life from the very beginning. My grandmother on the music side of things, but also from like, my grandmother taught me how to read. My grandmother taught me how to use the bathroom, like how to use a toilet, right? Like she is like, both my parents worked for my entire life, basically. Like I was there every single day at their house after school, and it was a huge. My grandmother just pushed me in so many directions that, like, looking back on it, like I didn't realize then what the contribution she was giving me. But like, she is one of the most brilliant women I've ever met, and like really knocked those smarts into my head too. And so from her contribution to my life is just enormous. My grandfather, in terms of business and everything else, like the entrepreneurial spirit, like that, a lot of that came from him. So what my grandfather ended up doing in his life was he became an insurance agent, and an independent insurance agent, working with a bunch of different companies. So like I distinctly, but he, especially in like when we crossed the like everyone needs a computer stage, my grandfather was not a computer literate person. I was. My grandmother had one, and I like figured out everything from being on her computer after school. And so like I like my mom became a graphic designer eventually. And so like I was learning how to pick up on some of that. So I was like building logos and all sorts of stuff for my grandfather's business, and like helping put together all these forms at an insurance agency, working at the office with him for a brief period of time. So in terms of, and then I would like go out and meet clients with him and learn how to talk to people. So like I was picking up a lot of this stuff just by osmosis, just like being around. And so, from that perspective of like that drive, I definitely credit a lot of that to him and my mom. And yeah, I mean, it just the combo of having two grandparents like that is something that's really important. And the saddest part about this pandemic has been able not to go back and see them, particularly my grandmother, who has had Alzheimer's for 12 years now, which is seeing someone that is highly intelligent lose to a degenerative brain disease is really heartbreaking, because it often happens to some of the smartest people among us. And so, that's been I'm glad she's still living, and most people don't live 12 years with it. But nonetheless, my younger brother's 7 years younger than me, and he loves her to death and gets to see her more frequently than I do. But nonetheless, he doesn't necessarily remember what she was like before it, and I do. And it's more heartbreaking to know what she was like and how brilliant she was before it kind of took over her life. But yeah, they've been a huge part of my life from as early as I can remember. So,
I mean, it sounds like they basically raised you.
Yeah.
How did that happen? How did they end up basically taking over and raising you?
So at first it was just I did have parents and we had our own home and everything. At first growing up, it was just that both my parents were super busy. So my dad worked from 9 a.m. to 6 or 7. And my mom also worked pretty long hours. And so I was just around a lot. I was their first grandkid, and so they were super invested in me. They have 4 from my mom's side of the family. But my 2 cousins don't live anywhere near them. We lived 15 minutes from them. So, my younger brother and I were around a lot. And my older brother too, who came in the picture at a later date. For me, originally it was just because my parents worked a lot, but then another part of my life that's kind of shaped me is my parents had a really nasty split when I was 9 years old. And, my mom was, and she'll say this herself, so I don't mind saying it. My mom was a broken person. And not that she did anything wrong, but when you have been married for 20 years and dedicated your life to someone and they ended up treating you really poorly, as my dad did to us and to her, it's heartbreaking. You kind of have to pick up the pieces and kind of figure out where to go from there. Yeah. And my mom, when I was, a preteen and early teenager, all the way up until really everybody still has some scars, but my mom's grown a lot as a person in the past few years, especially since I left home. I talk to her almost every day. But nonetheless, she was a broken person who needed her time and space. And sometimes she was really angry and upset. And sometimes that came out at us, in terms of being a little rude and raising her voice and other things. But nothing abusive. That I'll leave that to my father. But nonetheless, my mom needed space. And so I took it upon myself. I wanted to stay with my grandparents. Just because my little brother stayed with my mom a lot, but he was also very naive. But for me, I wanted to be around them. So when I got into esports, so that was because I was making and competing in Call of Duty stuff. I was making videos on YouTube about Call of Duty. I was competing in Call of Duty stuff on game battles. That happened in my grandparents' house all the time. I would just they didn't care. I would stay up till the only time I would get said anything to me is when I'd wake them up in the middle of the night from being loud. But I would stay in their kitchen and play COD on a tiny little flat screen TV until 4 a.m. That was my entry into all of this, and that happened at their house. So I didn't get a lot of sleep as a teenager, but I had a lot of fun. So both my mom was around always, but in terms of having to deal with her own struggles, I spent a ton of time around my grandparents as a teenager.
I mean, that's one of the things that I would have to say is I don't think people realize how young you are. And I'm not saying that you're older now, but relatively when you got into esports, you're still younger than me. Okay. I'm old as fuck. But you're still I don't think people realize how young you are because of how mature you act. Okay. But I feel like this has been something that you've probably always been and part of it was and you even mentioned it there. It was I took it upon myself to be I want to go stay here. That's a very mature way to kind of handle things and to have that introspection to be able to be I want to go here because this is what feels the best for me. That's
I mean I just my mom has this saying that I've been an old man since I came out of the womb, but which is really funny. But in terms of mental maturity, my parents' divorce is the biggest thing that has shaped me in that way. And I've talked to my mom a lot about this. My my father was fairly abusive, and then absentee after their divorce. Was not really a part of my life. First by choice, to be honest, by my choice. Again, another something of that. Like, I did not want to see my dad for the first few years. He stuck around after my parents' divorce because, like, why would I? Right? Like, the environment was already so bad. Why would I want to be a part of that?
Yeah.
And so I like chose not to see him, and the few times I did, things were not pretty. So and then he just left. Like, when I was like 13, he just disappeared, and I didn't talk to him for a number of years. We talk a couple times a year now. But it's still, my parents' divorce shaped me a lot in the sense that, like I said, my mom was a broken individual who had always had a partner to support her in the very patriarchal society that we unfortunately live in some sense, right? But so it took her time to like figure out the pieces, right? Especially like when they first split, like she had 3 kids. She had a 16-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 3-year-old, and I was the 9-year-old. And my older brother eventually went on his own path, which is not ended all that well. But nonetheless, like I was cognizant enough to know what was going on. My younger brother is not, so he doesn't remember a life with dad, really. But I do, and what it showed me is it's taught me a lot of things about relationships and about life and everything else. The first thing is like you can't be happy with someone else unless you're happy with yourself, right? Yeah. And both my parents, I think, were not happy individuals when they were together as individuals, and I think that. Like that's affected my own relationship. I've been dating the same person for 4 years. And I've like preached that to her and also tried to like live by it myself in terms of like, we need to like be individually fulfilled to be best together. And like not rush into anything. Right. Like I think, my parents were, so I'm adopted, as is my older brother and younger brother. But like my parent, I was the first kid because my older brother was adopted when he was older. But my parents adopted me when, if I do math correctly here, my parents adopted me when they were in their early 30s. So like, it's not like they were young parents. Yeah. Right? Like, but my dad comes from a background where like his dad walked out on his handicapped mother and her 3 children. And God. like my dad's side of the family is a piece of work. And, when you live and are raised by that, and like that is your example of men in your life, you probably aren't going to like, unless you are really motivated, you're probably not going to turn out to be much of a decent man yourself. And especially in a family dynamic. And that was my dad. Like my dad is I think he's changed a little bit now, but part of it, like I think he was fairly self-absorbed, and kids did not help that because as people who have children know, your attention is no longer on each other when you have children. Your attention is on your children, right? Like, and that's what my mom was. My mom like became a mom, right? Like she invested into me, invested into my brothers, and did not like spend the time like praising and like showing as much affection to my dad because like she was emotionally invested in raising us to be good kids. My dad did not handle that well. And that's kind of what happened in their marriage, is that he could not understand that, right? And he is a very much an emotionally needy person. And so from a maturity perspective, like that built me because I wanted to go away. Like really, and I had like really big aspirations, originally in music and then in esports. I went to New York City for the first time when I was 16 years old and by myself, and ended up like staying with some friends that I had met in the music industry in South Connecticut. And I just remember like, I took a bus from LaGuardia Airport to Grand Central. I remember looking out around me and being like, this is where I deserve to be. And I like knew right then, like no matter what I have to do in life, I will be here at some point. Right. And I was like for the past 2 years up until recently. And like I just wanted to be something bigger than the small town I grew up in. People in my town, like the most famous people to make it out of Noonan, Georgia, are like Alan Jackson, the country music artist, Alec Ogletree, who's an NFL player, Will Smith, who's a pitcher in the MLB, and then I think the list is pretty slim after there. But yeah, like and Will Lutz, the Saints kicker, who I went to high school with, and his parents were my teachers growing up. And yeah, his mom was my elementary school principal, and his dad was my 8th grade science teacher. Good family. But yeah, like I wanted to be so much bigger than that place. It made me angry the older I got, which is why I left high school early and went to college. It made me angry to like people's priorities, like were so out of whack, at least in my worldview, of like, they're worrying about like really stupid, immature stuff, and I'm worrying about what my life is going to be. Most people think about that at like 2021 when they're like ending college. I was thinking about that at 15, 16 years old. Like, what is my professional life going to be, and how am I going to get out of here? And I figured it out, but it was not linear. That's for sure. Certainly ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's how it is for everyone, though. I feel like most people don't get linear unless you. I feel like maybe if you come from a family of money, maybe it's a little bit more linear because you can make more mistakes so you don't fall. But otherwise, like I feel like that. So if you feel comfortable, completely, if you feel comfortable, what's some of the stuff that happened with your dad that you had to work through? Like, how did you work through it? Like, I can't imagine. Like, okay, so my stepdad was very abusive growing up. And the way that I handled it is I did not handle it in the most healthiest of ways. I would jump into video games, and I would try to avoid my world as much as I can because I couldn't escape where I was at until I eventually moved in with my dad. And that was like when I finally got, but I was fucked up for a long time because of this, because of the damage that happened. So what was your story like?
Yeah. So my father, there are like some that are really vivid instances of abuse. So my dad ended up, what happened is he had a woman who was his secretary that he had an affair with. And there are a couple instances that come to mind when you ask that question pretty vividly. One was I said something to her, having kind of like at this point, I was probably 7, 8 years old. So I was like cognizant that there was something going on. I had actually had a discussion with my mom where she let on a little bit about because I'm pretty sure she knew also. And I said something probably a little rude, but also just being a child. Nothing like I think I was like making copies or something in my dad's office. And I like told her to wait a second. And I think my tone was pretty rude. And my dad's secretary went into his office and told him that I had called her a whore. And my father came out and beat the living hell out of me, like belt off,
Jesus Christ,
in the back of the office. And my grandfather, my mom's father, had to stop that interaction because he worked in the same office and had to like come out and be like, enough, right? Like, and like I do not like. I believe she's no longer with my dad, so she's no longer my stepmother. But I do not like her anyway as an individual. Yeah. That sort of stuff was pretty common. And I was just like, I don't know, whatever. Right. Like, there's another instance of like being on Lake West Point, which is right next to Alabama, and not too far from where I grew up, where my dad like punched me on a boat. We were like on his bass boat, and I like talked back and got a fist to the face, which is unfortunate. And then the breaking straw. This is the last time. The last time I saw my dad in person, or last time I saw my dad in person prior to actually being an adult, because I when I was in Florida last, I got to see him when he was there a few years ago at CEO. He came up for a day. and we got dinner together. But yeah, so essentially, like him and my stepmother at the time are living in an apartment, and not too far from us, probably about 15, 20 minutes from where I grew up. He did actually have some custody right to my brother, or like visitation right to my brother. So my brother went to see him, younger brother went to see him a few times. And my father is a fairly prejudiced individual in terms of how I'll like line this up. And my younger brother has, because of some of this, some pretty severe detachment issues in terms of like, he likes being around people. He's definitely one of those people that thrives when others are around. And so my dad was giving my younger brother a bath, who was at the time, he had to be 6 or 7 years old, probably 7, 6 or 7 years old. And I was visiting that time because court had ordered that I had to go after I had pushed back for a number of years, for like 4 years, 3 or 4 years at that point. And they're like, he has to go. And so my brother was like freaking out in the bathtub, did not want to take a bath. And I ended up like, he basically like called for me, and I like tried to go in the bathroom to help him and like give him a bath because whatever, he's my younger brother. And my dad told me that was gay. And I was like really upset because my brother, and he was freaking out. And so my dad, we're in his bedroom, and he pushes me, and I rear back and punch him in the face. And that was the last time I saw my dad as a child. Because I was over it. Because of all the prior instances before that, I was not going to let myself be abused anymore. So I sat on the couch in their living room. My dad called my mom and said, "Come and get him." And my little brother stayed, and I did not. And that was the last time I saw my dad as a child.
Wow.
Because I had enough and sort of had put my foot down. I was not going to let myself be treated like that anymore. So all that to say, like, yeah, my dad and I have an interesting relationship. In a lot of ways, I feel sorry for him now. Yeah. Because one, I understand where that behavior has come from. When you're raised by it, it's really easy to become it. And my dad is, as I understand now, lives in Tennessee, and he lives alone. And my stepmom went out of the picture when money got rough and life got rough. And now he lives alone in Tennessee, and was doing some sort of real estate pre-pandemic. Now that got furloughed, and now just delivers pizzas for Papa John's. And he's 56 or 57 years old. And yeah, all that to say, like, I feel really bad for him more than anything.
Yeah. So when you put your foot down, like, I imagine that you don't walk away with that like scot-free, in the sense that your like mental can't be the best. Like, was there any issues that you had that you had to like work through that was like, hey, other people aren't going through this? I know for me, I just had a hard time like socializing with people a lot of times, because I was just so used to like, which I also got bullied in school, but so like I wasn't very good with like socializing. Did you have any issues like that you had to like work through like years after, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I actually got in trouble at school, and I was like superb student, never in trouble for anything, beta club leader and everything, right? Like but my behavior at school also was affected by this, because there were a couple of instances where I got in confrontations with people at school because I was just an angry child at that point, right? Like, I remember being in like 7th grade science class, and like, looking back, I'm such an idiot to do this, but nonetheless, there was a kid that I grew up with and actually was fairly close to. Good guy, small town good guy, right? And he was like making like some sort of annoying noise during a test, and I have a very hard time focusing anyway. And I told him to shut up in front of everyone, and he didn't. And I told him shut up again, and he said, "Make me." So I went over, and this kid is, I would say now he is like 5'6", 5'7". I am like almost 6 feet tall. Yeah. And even back then as children, I was bigger than him. And I went over to him, put my hand on his desk and just hit him right across the face. I was like, shut up now. Like, I'm trying to focus and take my test. And like, I was just an angry child. Like, I almost got kicked out of beta club for that. And like, I was not bad in high school. I kept my head down and like kept in my friend group. High school was a different animal, but like in middle school, I was like generally angry, and it was because of my dad. Yeah. You know, like for me, like I didn't realize that at the time that was all that way. In high school, I like very much poured myself into 3 different things, and that's sort of like how I figured out life. Is like I poured myself into athletics. So I was a football player and then a wrestler for 2 years in high school, and then I was doing the music stuff on the side by that point. That started in my freshman year. And then I was also just a good student. Like I was in gifted classes. So I was like one of 4 ninth grade students that got accepted into the AP government class, which was for juniors and seniors, because I took a placement test and did really well. So I poured myself into all those things and was exhausted all the time because of them. So they were not complementary, and there was no balance between the 3 of them. But nonetheless, like I didn't have time to be angry at that point. So
yeah, I mean that's one way to. So you just poured yourself into all of your work as much as you could later on. So that way, I mean that makes sense. I mean it's actually probably there's definitely way unhealthier ways that you could have went about that. That's for sure. Yeah. I want to just kind of close off this segment real fast. You mentioned that you actually do have some sort of relationship. What sparked that to happen? Because I know for me, at least, I don't have any relation. Well, I barely a relationship with my mom because of the stuff that happened. And it's. I would arguably say that it isn't really a relationship. What pushed you to get to a point where maybe you have some sort of contact?
So it was a couple different things. So the first was because this has been in 2 instances. So the first was I wrote a really sappy, but also angry. I had to be like 16 at that point. Facebook status about not having a dad, or at least not having an active after dad, which my dad actually saw. He was not friends with me on Facebook, but someone screenshotted it and took it and sent it to him. And we ended up talking a little bit then, and then I didn't really hear from him a lot. And then we reconnected probably 4.5 years ago. Because I was living in Connecticut at the time. So probably about 4 years ago, 2016, I want to say. And we would talk every now and then. And then we talked once, and it actually was my stepmom who answered the phone. And he had a stroke. And that was a big eye-opener for me, more so to the fact that I do not, and again, he's still living now and working a job, but nonetheless, I did not want my father to leave this world thinking I hated him, because I don't. I did at one point, 100%. Yeah. I did. But I've grown a lot emotionally as an individual and person to where I do not hate my dad. I feel sorry for my dad. I do not forgive what he did, the actions that he did, because they're kind of unforgivable. Oh, why would you do that to children? Yeah. But for me, like, I don't hate him, and I wanted him to know that I did not hate him. And so we've had those long discussions where I've been like, you know, and I think as much as he's capable of feeling sorry, he does. But I don't think that I think that he is sorry that he did these specific things, punching his children, abusing them, etc. But I don't think that he necessarily feels sorry for throwing his family away. Yeah. And if he does, it's because he feels lonely now, not because he's actually like remorseful for the action. Right. Yeah. That's my thought, at least. So, you know, like that was the big thing for me. And I haven't talked to him in probably about 2 months now, but I definitely have talked to him since I moved to Austin. Because I remember telling him about about Macchiato, the baby kitty that we rescued. But yeah, I definitely think that was the big thing for me. Like I don't want my dad to leave this world thinking that I hated him or that I hate him in any way. He has no relationship with my younger brother. My younger brother is more or less uninterested in having a relationship, knowing what he knows. And my older brother too. I've been having this moment a little bit with my older brother also, and I've been trying to like figure out how to get through it. And grain of salt, because things my dad's side of the family tell me, I don't always know if they are true. Yeah. But as I understand, my older brother has HIV. And my older brother did not take the divorce well and instead threw himself into drugs. So that was and ran off at 16 years old. Or 17 years old. Oh God. Yeah. And I've been trying to figure out how to approach that situation. My older brother's adopted but he's adopted from my dad's actual family. So he grew up with a lot of the same issues my dad has, and in broken homes that were changing all the time. He's my dad's younger brother's oldest child. I've been trying to figure out how to sort of hurdle over that because it's another person I just like feel bad for in terms of circumstance, right? Like not everyone finds the outlets that I have found to sort of get through life and express myself and want to build myself as an individual. Because for me, like when I have children, I don't want them to ever go through that. I want them to have a stable set of parents. I want them to not have to worry about money in the way that we did when my parents divorced and my mom was a single care provider making not enough money to provide for 3 children. I want my kids to have to work for things. I don't want to hand it to them. But at the same time, I also don't want them to have to worry about having a roof over their head. So like for me, like, I like use this as motivation to like, become professionally wealthy at one point, and sort of like build up who I am as an individual and be stable and build my relationship. That's important for me. My older brother I don't think had that amount of foresight, and he is a father to 2 kids, and that he is not a part of their life. And again, it's just like kind of passed down in a way because that's all they know.
I know it's really hard to like break that cycle too. Like you see it happen over and over and over again. It's really hard. One of the things that you mentioned was that you and your brothers are all adopted, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I ask what that's like being adopted? Because I imagine that like growing up, that's got to have a lot of questions in itself, right? Like why? Like I can only imagine because. I'm not adopted, but I would imagine that I would be having feelings or thoughts of like, why did this happen? Like those kinds of things that just seem very like stereotypical questions that it feels like someone will go through.
Yeah. So I was adopted. I came home on the day I turned 7 months old. So I don't remember my birth family. What I have heard about my birth family is that my birth father was much older. And a grown adult who had another family and a wife, and my birth mother was a 16-year-old. That is the story I have heard. Yeah, and neither of utmost character. In either regard, like I think both of them at one point probably had drug issues. But nonetheless, and actually. Another thing I do know is that when you adopt out a child, you have to have consent forms, right, to give them up. My birth mom did that in person, but they had to send a sheriff to a jail to get my birth father to do it. So he was in prison by the time I was born. He was in prison. So very limited information here. It does not make me in fact, like the 23andMe and stuff like that, like I'm like terrified to take them because of blood relatives, right? Like I don't know what sits behind that door, and it scares the living hell out of me as much as I am curious about sort of my heritage and background and everything else. But like, I also don't want to open that can of worms because I already have one screwed up side of the family. I don't need another. But to your point, right? Like, I think a lot of people view adoption as like, well, what about your real parents? Like, that's the biggest question I get all the time. And like, my real parents are my adopted mother and father. Yeah.
That's why I didn't say this, because I know that those are, because I have step parents and I know she's my mom. Like, it's not really my stepmom is just my mom. So
Yeah. So like to me, like, my adopted mother has been a very important part of my life. She still is today. But it does come with some questions. For me, like I was adopted in state. The whole background is that when the USSR fell, the Soviet Union fell, and there was the entire Eastern European communist collapse. When that happened, there were actually a lot of people who were smuggling children out of Europe into other parts of the country or other parts of the world, Central America, even in some cases, but also Western Europe, and were then basically holding these kids hostage and then adopting them out to Americans. And yeah, really terrible.
Jesus.
So essentially, like the U.S. in the mid '90s shut down adoptions for everyone outside of the country, right? Like you could not adopt from anywhere because the fear was like you were going to end up with a kid who was actually someone else's kid, and they didn't actually consent to give them up. They were taken and then held hostage, right? So there was a huge pool of parents looking to adopt in the 90s and not enough kids. Whereas like adoption is not a huge thing in the U.S. Most people just have their children and then put them through whatever terrible life they have, which is also not good. So my parents were on a wait list for a really long time to get me. And eventually like they were chosen by my birth mother. It's almost like a scrapbook of like, here's who these people are. And like, they like flip through and like she chooses, right. And she chose my adopted parents. Yeah. Like my adopted parents were prime fit, at least on paper. My adopted father was a successful insurance agent who had taken over my grandfather's business. My mom was a IT engineer who was like working for a bunch of big companies and making a handy amount of money at the time, pre-2008. And so like, yeah, they were like a prime fit for anyone, early 30s, right? Like looking, couldn't conceive a child of their own and wanted, but wanted kids. And, so I definitely have a lot of questions about what that is, but I also am like very terrified of like opening that door. Georgia adoption records are sealed. I can unseal them now that I'm an adult, if I so chose. And I have thought about it. Not going to lie, I have. But nonetheless, I'm also really scared of what may exist there. So I have been very cautious. My younger brother is someone I want to do this with him. And we may do this after Corona chills the hell out, although I don't know how long Central America will be affected. But my younger brother is actually adopted from Guatemala. And his story is way more wild than mine, at least in my perspective. Because my brother actually was kidnapped so he was born to a poor mother in Guatemala. Who was around and did not want to give him up, but also wanted a good life for him. So he spent time in an orphanage in Guatemala so they could take care of him and have food and everything else, resources. And then when the adoption process started, because it takes several months and like they get the last name changed and then they have to get U.S. citizenship and all of this, like it's very many hurdles for international adoptions for children. He actually was kidnapped by someone who worked in the orphanage who held him hostage, and my parents had to go there and basically like get the police involved, and they finally got him. He was when we first saw pictures of him at 3 or 4 months old, he was like super plump and like fat baby. When he came home, he was not. He was incredibly malnourished. He had whooping cough, which is really terrible to deal with. Yeah, I remember like going to doctor's appointments with my mom to make sure he was okay. His life started off very rough. One day, now that he is a 16-year-old and now can travel, one day I want to go back there with him and go to Guatemala City and like understand his heritage. It's not like we're not a Hispanic family. He doesn't speak a lick of Spanish. I speak more Spanish than he does because my girlfriend's family is Hispanic, but he doesn't speak a lick of the language, and he doesn't really know the heritage. But I think he would be interested from a perspective of like maybe not meeting his birth parents, but going back and like understanding where he came from and what it's like there. So I think
that makes sense.
I think that's something we're going to do. So.
Yeah. So you're probably a lot closer with your younger brother than your older brother, it sounds like.
Yeah. try to be as much as you can be with a teenager. That they certainly repel some of the like affection and love. My mom and my younger brother spent Christmas with us in New York this past year with me and my girlfriend. And it was a good time. They were there for about a week. And he wanted to come out here right now, but also Corona. And other commitments that he has in life. So that's not necessarily the safest option. But nonetheless, like when I first moved out in 2015, when I was 18 years old, this is part of my mom that I was mentioning about kind of being a little broken in some ways. I made it really clear what my intention was to leave and to move to Texas and drive 14 hours and get the hell out of there. And I said that for about 3 or 4 months. And my mom like ended up like, she didn't believe it. She thought I was bluffing. And I ended up like having someone call her from an apartment complex to get her as a guarantor. That didn't work out. So I like had to find an apartment where someone would lease to me by myself. Yeah. At 18 years old. And I did find one. But yeah, like I like tried to make it very clear, hey, I'm leaving. And my brother at that time, like, that was not passed along too well. So when I left, the day I left, that November, my mom went and got him from school, and he like broke down crying because I was leaving. And I think that definitely, at least for the first few years of me being gone and being really busy, living first in Texas and then in Connecticut, I think my brother definitely had a little bit of PTSD of what happened with my father, of being abandoned, and sort of saw that like every man in his life, myself included, had abandoned him. He does not feel that way anymore, I don't believe. We talk a lot more frequently now, especially now that he has his own phone and we can text and whatever else. But yeah, I think for a while there at first, he was 11 years old when I left. I think for a while there, he was really immature and didn't get it. I think now that he's a teenager and he understands teenage rebellion, I think he understands why I wanted to run away and like go and like build my own life. But that wasn't the case at first. I do think he felt like I kind of just walked out on short notice, which I didn't, but I could have been better at communicating that myself, but my mom could have too. So
yeah, that makes sense. So one of the interesting things about you is you mentioned that you started college very early on. That your goal was to do that. How do you get to a point where you're like, I'm done with high school. I just want to go to college?
Oh, I was just. You want to talk about anger? That was anger. And in terms of, I was, because I really remember this too. I was 15 years old, ninth grade year, and we were coming towards the end of the year. And I essentially went to my guidance counselor. I scheduled a meeting with her, and I went into her office, and I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. And it's just like, like the music stuff had started then for me. I felt like I needed to move on in life. Yeah. And I thought college was going to placate that sort of feeling, make me feel better about things. It didn't. But I thought that at the time. Yeah. And so I was like, how do we do this? Like, what do I need to do to accelerate this? And so like we went through all these hurdles. At that point, actually, the person who was our principal had, if I remember right, she had been promoted to the actual county school board who would make that ultimate decision of how my thing would go. So she knew me from my like ninth grade year. Or she was going to be promoted when I got on her desk, she was going to be promoted that summer. And so she knew me, like she knew the type of person I was, like the student I was. And I didn't go to a small school by any means, but nonetheless, like I was I was the leader of a worship leader in the FCA, one of the bigger student organizations. I was a part of our choir and like had various different things to perform at like Christmas concerts. Like I made myself visibly present in front of these people. Right. So yeah, like I basically said, I want to get out of here. And so we devised like the plan that I would do 10th grade, the entirety of 10th grade in my school. And then 11th grade, I would still be enrolled at the high school, but I'd have half my semester or half my year, or one full semester, full college classes at a local community college. And then by the time 11th grade, second semester come down, I'd be nothing but that. and all that through 12th grade. And I'd be done with high school. I didn't actually get I didn't even walk graduation, my choice. But I didn't get my diploma early technically because they couldn't. There was like some sort of like legal hurdle. Like they couldn't give it to me. But basically, like I went to college and at a local community college, and I went there every day. Did not go back to high school other than for one semester of athletics that I chose to do in 11th grade for football. But yeah, like I was full-time college studying computer information systems. The idea that we had devised was that I would do computer information systems at college, at a community college, until I was 18 and could live on my own. And then the idea was to try to transfer to a bigger university and study computer science. That was the plan originally. That's not what happened in the end. What happened in the end was I ended up going to college and I was bored. I was so bored. I had classes that like, I don't want to be a demeaning person, but at the same time, like I had some people that were my classmates that I was just like, what the hell are you thinking? Like, like definitely like question intellect. Again, I'm going to a community college, so the standards are really low anyway, but I didn't have many choices.
When I went to my master's program, I'm telling you, I had the same thought. So I don't think it ever gets better.
The breaking point for me, though, was at the end of 2014, I started writing about esports, about League of Legends. The 2014 League of Legends World Championship was like the moment that I speaking of my mom, she's calling right now. I'll call her back. Anyway, the breaking point for me was that I had started writing about esports at the end of that fall semester, in what would have been my senior year of high school, but what ultimately was my sophomore year of college. The way that thing worked. And so I ended up doing all of these courses and I was writing at the same time, and I stayed up the entirety of October because it was in Southeast Asia and Korea, to watch the League of Legends World Championship in 2014. And I was like invigorated. Like I watched that Samsung White Star Hunt Royal Club final and I was just like, like I need to be a part of this somehow, some way, something, right? Like I had watched for several seasons all the way past season 2 years before. I was like super set on being a part of the esports scene. And I basically had been reading Drexen and Thorin and Richard Lewis and all these people. And then I called into Richard Lewis's talk show, Trash Talk, and was just like, I basically had a take on Dignitas's off-season roster changes. That was an uninformed take, but I had a take. And then I ended the call with like, hey, I submitted something to your site think piece. Haven't gotten a response back, but would love to talk to you about this. And he was like, okay. And then he followed me on Twitter actually, and we started DMing. And he pointed me in Drexen's direction to Freelancer Esports Heaven, which is the beginning of my career. Richard had done that. So I continued in college for that following spring. And the snapping point for me was I had a professor who came in, and this was a web development class. And at the time, HTML5 and CSS3 were out. And the professor basically goes, I haven't taught this in 10 years. Here's the book that we're using. And it's like super dated. Like we're using tables to make menus. And I blew through that course as someone who had like self-taught web development all those years before, like as a part of my music stuff and everything else I was doing. Right. Like I was just like, this is easy. This is the easiest, like one of the easiest things I've ever done. And so he asked me to help teach. And like, that was the moment that I was like, I don't need to be here anymore. Like if I know more than the professor about modern day coding and he is being paid to teach us coding, why am I here? Yeah. And that lined up perfectly actually with after I freelanced for Esports Heaven, I broke the big story about Corey and Meet Your Makers. I then went on to break another series of stories about TSM and their challenger team cheating by getting scrim information, scrim recordings off of another team, off of the CLG team, about Team Fusion, who were like one of the best challenger teams at the time. And then I wrote for Chieffinity. I ended up writing for the Score for a piece.
Yep.
I have big, strong feelings about the Score and how they handled that entire ordeal. And because I wrote at the Score, the Daily Dot came to me. They did not want to lose a breaking news reporter to their competitor. The Daily Dot was the biggest esports site in the world at that point. The Score was coming in with much more money and swinging everything around and trying to pick up all the talent. And the Daily Dot was like, okay, here's a stipend, monthly stipend to work exclusively for us. Here's a path for it to get bigger, that stipend to increase. And basically I went into that summer with the goal of like, I want to make this a full-time gig, make enough money to do this full-time. And I did. And then I basically told my mom at the end of that semester, I'm going to drop out if this becomes a thing that can be a full-time opportunity. And it did. And so I dropped out. And that eventually led to ESPN. Actually, not that much longer than that. So
5 months when you were full time is the dates that I have. So so that brings me to a couple interesting questions, I think. So starting off here, you start working in the esports scene, and one of the interesting things, I've had this conversation with a lot of people on like journalism and whether or not I think that the journalism that we had back in 2015, 2016 is even a remote possibility, because I don't think it is. But we'll get into that in a minute. But I want to start off with, how did you start out networking and breaking these stories? Because I would say, as far as like investigative journalism, there's you, there's Richard Lewis, and like nowadays, I think those are the only two people who are really doing it left. There's like occasionally an article that comes out. So like the riot story, and bless my mind, I can't remember who wrote the riot sexual harassment. But there's not really a lot of people who do investigative journalism. And I feel like back in 2015, 2016, there was actually a lot more. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there was like 5 or 6 people, I think, then. And now there's two, really. There's kind of two. And I mean, even Richard doesn't really do as much investigative journalism anymore, I don't think. So, I mean, how did you start to build up that network to get into it? Because you're kind of almost one of the last people standing who kind of does this all the time. Like, that's really what you focus on.
Yeah. Glad that's not just my assessment of the situation. I wish there were more people doing this on a full-time basis. There are some people like Cecilia who do fantastic work, but esports is not their full-time thing. So one of the lessons I learned from being in the music industry was like networking is everything.
Yes.
My responsibility in the music world was 2 things, depending on what side of the label or like what side of the coin I was on, whether I was label manager or artist manager. Label manager, my job is to convince people to release music with us, talented artists and people who in some cases have much bigger audience than we do. Because we're a startup, right? But we're trying to get in those doors, and like we didn't have oodles of money to throw at them and be like, here's an advance, come release with us, right? Yeah. So like that was like I had to be very good at like convincing people and like talking vision and understand like thinking these things through, right? Like understanding where we wanted to go with releases, how we wanted to put them out, like distribution, all this stuff, and like commit to them. And they had to personally believe in me, right? Like this is super important. As an artist manager, I'm on the other side of flip side of the coin, where like I'm trying to convince promoters at clubs and events and festivals, and also labels to release my artist. And I had to be like really good at that too. And all that to say, like it is a certain amount of dealing with people, understanding that everyone is uniquely individual, and that like you have to care about those people, and you have to build genuine relationships with them to the point where like they trust you, because maybe you have, and this did happen at some instances, maybe you have one artist who like is uber talented, like everything they make is very good, right? Like they strike gold 99% of the time. Maybe you then have an artist whose hit rate is much lower in terms of them being able to strike gold. You represent both these people. The first one, you have a really easy job of getting into a label, because like their music speaks for themselves in a type of way, right? Like it's just really good. And a good label manager will hear it and go, damn, I can sell that. In terms of the second artist, you have to know when to identify when they're hitting gold and how to guide them to do it. And then you also have to convince that, in some cases, that same label manager, because of the trust you built from the first artist, to take a shot on the second person, right? And so you have to build trust with those types of people. And so, even though like I definitely made a ton of mistakes in the music industry, those values were super important. I do not think I could do my job today without understanding people the way that I did by working in that industry, which actually is kind of similar to this one in the way people handle things and dynamics. So I like very much came into esports wanting to know everyone. My original plan before being a journalist was my grandfather knew a few investors who were looking for new opportunities to invest. And it actually didn't cost a lot to own a League of Legends Challenger team at the time. And there were a few of them, like Final Five is the one I distinctly remember, who had very little money. And that 2014, that was that promotion tournament where Final Five like made that like really long run. And then they were going to be a part of CS, and they like looked like they could maybe even qualify for the LCS, and they had no money before they were acquired by Coast, which happened a few months later. But nonetheless, I like started talking to Nicole, who was their team manager at the time. I started talking to Shorter Ace, their jungler, and the entire time, like I'm just like trying to meet everyone. And the way I find these people is not that hard. Like you just add them on Facebook, right? Like it's not rocket science. And that's what we did in the music industry too, actually. And so I just like one-to-one took the thing and added these people and started talking to them. And that didn't work out. It wasn't the right time. I also like couldn't get enough of a commitment from my grandfather's friends to like really in good faith move forward any further than I did with that, other than like having those initial discussions. But again, I was like still very driven to be a part of this industry. And from a journalism perspective, that just came naturally in terms of like talking to a bunch of people and just networking like that, sticking my neck out there, right? In terms of like just introducing myself to people all the time. It started a lot on the like challenger level, lower LCS level. And back then, and I'm sure we can dive into this a little bit, I think part of the reason people have issues with this now is because access is harder to get. Yeah. But back then, there were no billionaires playing around this space. Now, many of the people I met back then work for the billionaires. Yeah. But they didn't at the time. They were just like either they were team owners themselves or they were managers or whatever else, right? Like very like medium level employees who now they vouch for me for their bosses because I was good to them and have been good to them over the years, and they are willing to stand up for me and put a good word in. But yeah, like as much as I have a massive amount of admiration for Richard Lewis, but Richard Lewis and I disagree on many things. How you treat people is one of them. And one thing I've had the benefit of coming into this industry after him is the fact that like I generally, unless somebody was a real big asshole, I was fairly nice to everyone. And he was not. And so there were some people that were just partial to talk to me and not him. And so like I kind of disagree with his philosophy of how he engages people, especially on social media, even though I have a lot of respect for the work he does and a lot of respect for him, right? Like we still talk, not as frequently as we used to when we were colleagues, but in terms of like keeping in touch, that still happens. So, like for me, like it was just networking and like the biggest tools. I think Facebook is still useful now, but I don't think Skype is anywhat useful anymore. But it used to be, and I used to be the king of Facebook in the Skype directory and understanding how to find people in the Skype directory, using search terms and a little bit of social engineering in terms of like searching people by email address and that's on their Twitter bio and all that other things. Like There's a level of doing this. And then just like the big thing is like building genuine relationships. A lot of the time I was not always after a story.
Yeah.
I was just like wanting to talk to people. And then eventually when there was a story, they were more comfortable talking to me because I talked to them for a long period of time. But it was certainly not, it has gotten easier for me over the years. My first and second year were fairly tumultuous because the reporting was not as accepted as it is now. So oddly enough, I think it was easier to break in back then, but less socially acceptable to do the work that we do now.
Yeah.
Now I think it's much more socially acceptable and praised now, but also much harder to break in. So I hit like the perfect time in my opinion.
Yeah, that I mean, I think that makes sense. So when you first start, that's another thing I was going to break into is like, you're right when you say that it wasn't as socially acceptable. So how did you make the decision that, you know what I want to do? I want to do investigative journalism. The one thing that, honest to God, everyone in this industry at this time hates seeing any one of us post things about their name.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember distinctly, like something that happened to Richard was the whole like Hanser situation with Curse Academy, where like Steve Aronset, who's now the co-CEO of Team Liquid, was the head of Team Curse back then, like straight up called him a liar, and then like 2 days later, the move was announced, and Richard was right, and I'm just like, like why? Like why would you say that? Like it just shut up, right? And I've actually told a few esports executives, hey, if you don't like what I wrote, but it's true, just shut up. Like that's my best advice. But yeah, at the time, like, it wasn't necessarily intentional. I wanted to be like many other people, an opinion writer or an analyst with game takes. But that changed with a few different stories. The first coming to mind was when Final Five actually kicked Shorter Ace, like the day before a competition. I ended up interviewing him, having known him at that point, and got like exclusive quotes. And then I got word that like Nevo, a European challenger team, was being acquired by G2. I actually do remember that one very vividly because I wrote that for Gfinity. And actually one of the people who owned Nevo was actually a tournament admin for Gfinity and tried to get me fired.
Really?
It was a freelance gig, but it came after my head pretty hard. And my editor at Gfinity, to his credit, stood up for me and said, like, we believe Jacob. And then there was the Corey story about Corey and Meet Your Makers. And I don't know how super comfortable this person is to talk about this. So I'll keep it a little vague. But there was another reporter in another outlet who had that entire story, top to bottom, all of it. And his outlet, this shows you what we do. I think this still happens, by the way. His outlet was scared to publish it in fear of making Meet Your Makers upset and Riot upset. Because actually, if you remember correctly, Corey emailed Nick Allen, who worked at Riot at the time, and Nick Allen didn't respond to him. And then Corey like fled to Canada. There was a lot of weird stuff there. Yeah, it was bad. But this other reporter had the story and top to bottom and like could have beaten Richard and I to it actually. And his outlet just did not have any spine to put it out there. So I started to hear a little bit of rumors about it. I actually reached out to this reporter and was like, hey, I like am hearing this. Have you, like, we had built a little bit of a relationship. I was like, you hearing some of this stuff? And he goes, yeah, not only am I hearing it, I have it all. And my place is not going to publish it here. And sends me a zip folder of audio recordings and a bunch of other things. It's like dumps it right there in my lap. And I did a lot of legwork to confirm some of that, to like double check with other sources, interview other people. I remember I interviewed LS on the record for that piece because he had some issues with Meet Your Makers too. But yeah, that like showed me that like this industry had some really underlying issues with journalism, even when outlets aren't willing to stand up for themselves. And also he gave that same zip folder to Richard. So we both like got it on equal footing. We actually broke the story within like minutes of each other for Dot and Esports Heaven. And they both blew up. I had a little bit more than Richard in some instances. He had more than I did in others. So, you know, each story was worth reading because they had their own sort of unique information. mine was not well written, but nonetheless, like it had what you needed to know. So like that story was like, it was a very big establishment story for me. I started being asked to come on to other shows, started being given more opportunities to write other places, like The Score. And I actually remember another person who broke in right around the same time. It's really funny because he did a legal analysis of Corey's contract, was Bryce Plum. He actually had like no clients back then in esports, at least. And he was trying to get into the industry. He was passionate about it. And he did a legal assessment of Richard and I's articles and the contract that Richard gave him in a Reddit thread. And that was like one of Bryce's early esports things. So, and now he's like the biggest lawyer in the industry. But funny how things change. I laugh about that with Bryce time and time again when we talk and get to catch up and shoot the shit. But like it was, I remember distinctly a couple different things about like I had one thing where I had to like call Hotshot GG and like dictate a statement. Like he was like saying it, I was typing it for like an article where CLG had been involved in that. CLG Challenger had been involved in that cheating scandal with TSM, TSM secondary team, and like even then it was like, you sure this happened? I was like, yes, I have the link to the private VODs and I have chat logs that show that this person asked for them and got sent this link. So yes, I'm positive it happened. But even then it was like super controversial. And like I had another issue later down the line with CLG regarding Corey, actually, because some of their players were reaching out to him to try to recruit him. And the org wasn't aware and they called me a liar and it was really weird. I could have been a lot better in the way that I wrote that story. I would not write it the same way now, knowing what I know. I still stand by like the actual facts of the situation that a player of CLG was trying to recruit him to come join their team. Whether the organization was trying or not is a different story, but also kind of Wild West back then where players were still doing that kind of stuff and tampering all the time. It's happened a few times. And I actually had a few stories I broke where that was the case. And then it ended up ultimately not happening because obviously either Riot stepped in or whatever else. But yeah, I mean, like I had a few mess ups in my first year. I had a few stories I broke that were either wrong or that changed after they were broken. And people did not like me. And that even continued. I broke enough stories by the end of 2015 that like I ended up becoming the entity that like ESPN hired in 2016, right? In terms of my like news credibility. But people still didn't like me. Like I was still a pretty disliked figure even into 2016. That really started to change at the end of 2016 and early 2017. It was like the big turning point for people kind of coming around. But that also required me to like basically take out every single North American team owner to a meal and like kind of lay it on them about journalism. I think I have had very thorough journalism discussions with, I want to make sure I'm right about this. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've had very thorough journalism discussions, casual discussions with every owner or every executive, top executive, CEO, president, whatever it is, of every single LCS team at this point. And with most of Overwatch League too. And like casual, totally off the record, right? Like I'm not going to share what happened in those discussions, but like I've had those discussions and it's been an active measure of like, this is what I do. If you don't like it, be quiet, right? Like if I'm wrong, that's a different story. But if I'm right and you're upset, different story. But I've had those thorough discussions with all of them, or most of them between those two leagues. But it's been a really active measure. So
my question, I guess this is a very odd question. Why do people come to you and want to break the stories, right? Is it like these people are wanting to get back at people? Like, what's the reason that people come to you to break these stories? Because I guess for me, like having worked on a team, I don't think I would ever probably go to a journalist like that. Like if I'm working on the team, like my best interest is obviously, generally speaking, it's to fix the problem, not to go to a journalist, right? So why do people come to you?
I think some of it can be vindictive. What I was not good at the beginning of my career what I am good at now is separating that. If I know someone is vindictive, I have to take everything they're telling me with a grain of salt, because some of it could be spun, right? Like, you have to understand someone's motivations for talking to you. You have to understand a few different things about when someone talks to you. You have to understand, most importantly, is who are their friends. I think about this a lot. So say you tell me something, and then your best friend, somebody else, tells me something. That's like having one person tell me something, because essentially you two talk. I had the understanding that the two of you talk. You probably brought this up, and then both of you telling me it is as good as one source. I was not good at that at the beginning of my career, and I made a couple of different flubs from having people who talk to each other. And then I was like, oh, I have 3 sources. No, they all talk to one another. So there were 3 people, but it was all one singular bit of information coming from one mouth in the original. So like, I have to understand that. And then also from the vindictive perspective, if someone has an agenda, I have to know. Sometimes I would just like blatantly ask, why are you telling me this? And in other situations, like, I can deduce. People use charged language, et cetera, right? Like, you can deduce that people are upset. At first, and even still today, I would say, like, I think a lot of people, particularly younger, I've noticed some young journalists get upset with me. And I think it's because and I hate saying this, but I think some people can be a little envious of the work I do, in the sense that, like, they're like, oh, he works at ESPN, everybody gives him everything because he's ESPN, right? Yeah. That's not true. Look, there is a privilege of working at ESPN without a question. I get in certain rooms that no one else can because I have 4 letters attached to my name. I get it, right? Like, that does not negate, in my opinion, does not negate the hard work that I've done, the hard work I continue to do. And not every story I get involves someone handing it in my lap. Actually, the majority of them do not. I do have some stories that people just like straight up just blank tell me. Most of them come with me like either making assumptions and then digging and then finding, right? Like, I think something will happen and then I go and seek it out and find it and like assure in fact that it is indeed happening. And then the other part of it too is just like, I'll hear something or see something in the tea leaves and I'll dig. And then I'll find what I'm looking for. A lot of it's just been like talking to people all the time. Like, this has changed a little bit recently because my responsibilities have expanded in terms of the type of content I'm doing at ESPN. Yeah. But at least for like a while there, my week was like probably like 40 or 50 phone calls a week. And probably like 3 stories a week. 2 stories a week, right? Like, not every phone call converts into a story, but the idea being that like you talk to a bunch of people, you cast a really wide net, you find a lot of things. So it's changed a little bit now, but I still do that. Like, I still actively like dig and talk to various different people, get information, and then keep pushing until I find what I actually am looking for. So it is a difficult process. From a motivation perspective, I think a lot of people are like very curious about things, and then they understand that like the audience will be curious about the same things. The general public would be interested in these things. And so they tell me, and then I go and fact check it, many different ways, and then end up publishing it. So, but I think if anything, the one thing I pride myself a lot in my career is like, I've never burned a source ever. I have no intentions to ever burn a source. I have had companies threaten me unless I give over my sources, and I've not back down from that. Like, I've had credentials revoked because I wouldn't give over source. Like, this stuff I've been in really weird, tricky scenarios with that stuff, and I've just never broken that source confidentiality. Like, I've always stood up for my sources. Because that's what you do. It's the most important part of this job.
I mean, if you don't have that, then you basically don't have a job anymore. Because
who's going to talk to you, right? Like,
I feel like that's. Does that make it tricky? I mean, because we met when you were breaking your ROX piece. Okay, you mentioned that on kind of like Twitter, and that was a pretty big piece. But I also remember some of the backlash that happened with that piece, which was pretty extreme. Yeah. As far as like, I mean, do you want to go into it? I mean, I don't know how much you've actually told, but yeah, I
actually haven't told as much as, I feel comfortable talking about it.
Yeah. I don't know how much I know versus how much you want to tell. So, You want to lead right into it? You were writing a piece on the ROX Tigers. What was this piece about? And you released it, and what happened?
So, interesting part here of this story, because I think a lot of how that story came to be, people make bad assumptions. A lot of teams made bad assumptions. Other teams besides ROX made bad assumptions too. So I actually heard before the World Championship had even begun.
Yeah,
I had heard that this team, the ROX Tigers, was going to disband following the World Championship. For people unfamiliar with the ROX Tigers, they changed names, I believe, 4 times before they were ROX. ROX was their 4th name. So they were the Huya Tigers, the Ku Tigers, and the GE Tigers before they were the ROX Tigers. And Huya, GE, and Ku were all different sponsors.
Yeah.
Before they, and then ROX was what they called themselves because they were tight like ROX as a family, right? Like that's the name. And this org, this is how you know it was a different time in esports. This still exists in some Korean organizations, but definitely it was a different time than it is now, especially with LCK franchising on the horizon soon. This org was like perpetually broke. Like they were in very dire financial straits, but they also had the second best team in the world, right? Like went to finals the year before this in 2015. They went to semifinals at Madison Square Garden, even that year that they were going to break up. And so I had heard like knowing all these things, there were a bunch of Western teams, particularly in North America, eager to meet because the World Championship was in NA that year, were eager to meet these people, these players.
Yeah.
SMEP, Gorilla, etc. Because these NA 2016 and 2015 were the big investment years. So these NA orgs had just like oodles of money laying around. Yep. And why not recruit one of the best players in all of Korea to come join your team for, a hefty sum that they can't find at this organization that has no money. Right. And so I remember I first pitched this story in a World's planning meeting. Probably about 4 weeks before it actually broke, 4.5 weeks before it broke in Connecticut. I was in a conference room with my colleagues. We had others on the phone, including Feon, my colleague who is very plugged into Korean League of Legends. And essentially I said in that meeting, here's the story I have. I think we're going to have it at some point during this event, but understanding Korean culture and understanding just the way you do your job as a journalist, I wanted to sit down with the people in charge, the manager of ROX Tigers, and have a discussion with her in which I was going to say, here is the story we are going to break. I would like to talk to you about this, either on the record or whatever makes you comfortable. This is what I wanted to do. And so we knew I was going to go to the Chicago quarterfinal leg of Worlds. The idea was going to be that I would go there, and part of my responsibility, in addition to covering the event, would be to sit down with this person and talk to them. That's what I was going to do. That is what I had planned to do. Be respectful to her, be respectful to the team, everything. When I got there, I was messaging a few other people that knew her, confirmed she was in town, and but I had no way to get to her. I didn't know what hotel they were staying at. I didn't speak Korean, and so, and this was a little naive of me at the time. So I told Riot what I had. And I said, like, here's the story that I have. I'm very confident in its accuracy. I would like to talk to them. It can be during somebody else's event, however we want to set this up. I was then told by someone at Riot a couple different things. One, that they had a comment. The ROX Tigers had a comment they were preparing to give me, but that I had to hold the story till after the World Championship, which there's a risk to that. This 2.5 weeks, right? Like somebody else could have found the story. And especially when I start kicking the hornet's nest a little bit, more people are going to find out. And the second part of that was that she actually wasn't there, is what I was told by someone at Riot. That was not
interesting.
True. Riot, she was there. She was 100% there with the team. Why wouldn't she be? Like she's the manager of the team. So I got frustrated with Riot and confronted someone at Riot, and subsequently got in trouble and I tried to have a like off the record discussion with Gorilla after they won their match to like figure out where she was. Someone from Riot interrupted that discussion and asked me to leave. And that was the night that you and I spent where I was in a lot of like ESPN got involved and the whole thing was really difficult. We broke the story the next morning. I ended up watching the majority of the matches from my hotel room, but I did end up going to the press room for a little bit. That was the H2K Albus Nox Luna match, was that Sunday. And I was told by Riot, no teams wanted to talk to me after the ROX story broke that morning. I was later told that like all the teams thought I was going to break stories about them in the same. Not true. If you remember the ROX statement, it was actually really aggressive towards me and ESPN as an outlet. And in fact said that they had like asked me not to publish it.
Yeah.
Which, again, I didn't talk to them directly. I talked to them via Riot, however you want it, game telephone here. And they like everyone sided with them. There were a couple different community figures who I have since talked to, Monte Cristo and Susie Kim being among them, loudest among them, saying that I was wrong. In their fairness, I don't think they had the full context of the situation, or at least the full context of the situation as I did. And look, like no one wanted to see ROX break up. They were like a beloved team, right? They were a beloved team. No one wanted this to happen. And I've been in that position where I've had to be messenger about things that people don't like anyway, or like to hear. And so that story broke, and they like just kind of ran me over in the court of public opinion. There's nothing I could do, and said that they were going to put more stuff out. And I was just like told, keep my head down and keep doing the work I was doing. I was originally told I was not going to get any interviews that night. And I actually thank H2K Rich and Harris Peskin, who used to work at H2K at the time, because they stood up for me and they told me that I could come to the venue and interview Forgiven and Vander in front of it. And I will never forget that, because that was a very low moment for me that weekend. And they, I had known H2K Rich for a little bit at that point. Like they stood up for me and allowed me to do that, allowed me to continue to do my job and interview Forgiven and Vander.
Yeah.
Before they went to semifinals in New York. I didn't end up going to New York. I actually was scheduled to go to E-League the following week, because it was E-League Season 2 opening in Atlanta. And then the week after that, I actually did go to Los Angeles. I was not given a press credential for Los Angeles. So I was kind of just there. I actually ended up in a much better situation. Anyway, because instead what happened was Jordan Rambis, who is the son of Kurt Rambis, the ex NBA player and now NBA coach. And his mom is Linda Rambis, who is Jeannie Buss's right-hand woman at the Lakers. He was getting involved in esports. He was a part of at the time, part of Axiomatic, which is the ownership group that had bought Liquid. Magic Johnson, who is he's the Rambis family is like very closely connected to the Lakers still, and also to Magic, who is a part of Axiomatic's investment group, or the initial investment group. Jordan got me a ticket to the Lakers ownership suite, which was being rented out by Bruce Stein, who is the CEO of Axiomatic, and Peter Guber, who is one of the investors in Axiomatic, but also the co-owner or co-chairman of the Golden State Warriors. And they were renting out this suite for the World Finals in 2016 at Staples Center. So instead of going and sitting in the nosebleeds with my colleagues, I spent that event in the hottest room to be in that arena, with every single team owner imaginable cycling through that door. Steve Aronsett from Liquid, Andy Den, Reginald from TSM, Carlos Rodriguez from G2's Ocelot. That everyone, Jack Etienne, all of them were cycling through this door, even though their teams weren't playing. That was a SKT Samsung final. But nonetheless, everyone was in and out of that room. I interviewed Bruce. I interviewed Peter. I got to know them. I started, kind of talking to people and meeting people in that room. I met some people I consider really close friends now in that room that I've kept up with over the years, and had some very personal discussions with. And like that was way more beneficial than being in the press seating. So odd situation. But nonetheless, it ended in the end. The month to follow was the hardest part, though. After breaking that story, I was like, everyone basically like called me fake news for a while. And there was, I don't think people realize, I'd have to look at the specific date, but between the day that story broke, the Sunday of those quarterfinals, all the way up until the actual, until I was like actually vindicated and the story came true, that was probably about 6 weeks, from like mid to late October all the way to Thanksgiving. So that was a long period of time, and I broke a lot of stories about the off season in between that time. Yeah. And no one believed me anytime. Like every time it'd be like, remember, this is the guy that wrote the ROX Tigers thing or whatever. Right. And then Thanksgiving morning, I went to visit my girlfriend's family in South Texas. We're like laying in her bed in her room and at their house. And I wake up to like look at my phone. My phone is hot to the touch. Like it is scalding. Like it clearly had been working all night, doing something. And I had just hundreds of messages, Twitter DMs, Skype messages, Discord, everything just like flooded my phone. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so I opened Reddit, and sure enough, the top like 7 of the top 10 headlines are like, Smeb leaves ROX Tigers, Gorilla leaves ROX Tigers, statement from ROX Tigers. And I'm just like this is Thanksgiving. This is literally Thanksgiving morning. And I was just like, oh my God, like, whoa, I like that story. I've broken a lot of stories in my day, and hundreds, and no one story has been in a position where I risked so much, but also gained a lot from.
Yeah.
If I was wrong about that story, my career was probably over.
Yeah.
There were a lot of stakes, and that's why I was so like emotionally distraught the night that you and I spent some time with some of our friends, because I knew that risk, and I took it knowing what I knew that Sunday night. And then, but also at the same time, when I was vindicated, when it came out, I was right. No one had said sorry. Every person who had given me death threats or like tried to like find my home information and publish it on the internet and all the crazy other things that happened in there, right? Like ended up like, trying to like figure out my relationship status. It was really creepy. People on the internet are weird, and they were like incredibly vindictive that I like attacked, again, framing of journalism here, attacked their favorite team. It was bad. But no one said sorry for any of that stuff. But what did happen is the next time I started breaking stories, people instead were like, it was like, remember, this is the guy that broke the ROX story. And it was no longer a negative thing. It was a positive thing of like, wow, if he like got that crazy one right, he's probably right on this much more minor thing. And after that year, like that's when I really took that initiative to like start seeking people out and explaining journalism and really like all of 2017, because that was the LCS franchising year, was 2017 was when all those applications were going down, that like I really like sought it out to like explain and sort of, this is my motivation. This is what I'm doing. This is where I come from. This is not a personal endeavor, et cetera. But that all happened because there was a lot of abuse that came with that story.
Yeah, I remember a lot of that stuff happening and being like, Jesus Christ, I can't believe this is kind of going on. I guess that brings me to kind of my next topic then. What's happened with esports journalism? Because from my perspective, which is a very loaded question, I guess, from my perspective, it's kind of dead, minus like ESPN. And a lot of it feels like it's due to money. Like, I'm not going to lie. Like you mentioned the sources thing earlier, like how you won't give up a source. I can see someone who isn't working for ESPN being a lot more scared to do that because the person that they're working for doesn't have the financial backing to protect them.
Yeah, you're on the right path here. I think there's a few things, and they make me both angry and upset and sad at the same time. So the big thing I think is that all those things that we just talked about how controversial reporting was in 2015 and 2016. A lot of people still think that exists today. And so when like a young journalist comes in, they're like, I don't want to break that news. I don't want to be hated.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't want every team owner in the world to hate me. That's just not true. Like, that's just not how things work anymore. And like, I will pat myself on the back there a little bit of taking that initiative to stop attacking journalists. Right. Like, I say that publicly. I've said it to many people's face. Right. Like, and also the other part of this is that like all the billionaire investors who have come in from sports and tech and everything, like those people are used to media coverage. So they are telling their CEOs and stuff, stop being an ass, right? Like, stop attacking the press, chill the hell out. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, if somebody came in and started breaking news right now, as long as their tact was good, because I have seen some people break some news and then be really rude to people for no apparent reason. They just see it as this adversarial thing. Yeah. Whatever. That's not the right tact. If you're listening to this, don't take that tact. I think as long as you're respectful in the way that you go about it, you give people proper time to comment, you reach out, etc., and you have those genuine relationships, people are not going to hold a grudge against you. And I think the fear of that you're going to be disliked is stupid. This is not a job where you're supposed to be liked. Being liked is an added benefit to this job. Right. And I just, it blows me away, how that sort of still lingers. I get a ton of questions from young journalists who are like, how do I do what you do or whatever. Right. And it's hard to answer that because like I said, my time was a little different how I got started and things have shifted. I think it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg. When I view this, to your point about money, journalists want to come into the space either fresh out of school or just no schooling experience, whatever. And they want to make money doing this. But what do they have to offer that others don't? Right? Like, why is your opinion on a game any more valuable than anyone else? And why is your opinion on a game any more valuable than the umpteen people that do that? The Mark C's of the world, the Emily Arantz of the world, Tyler Erzbergers, right? Like, those people are already established doing that. I was very fortunate that when I came in, I was in a situation living at home with my mom and being a college student, I didn't need that financial prop up immediately, right? Like, journalism is a job of sacrifice. It always has been because it's not incredibly financially lucrative. Like, if you want to go make a ton of money, go do something else. Yeah. Right? Like, this is not the job where I'm very fortunate now because I've worked for ESPN for 4 years and they take care of me. But at the same time, it wasn't always that way for me. Like, I didn't make a good solid living wage doing this always. And I had to make sacrifices along the way to be able to do this. So go into PR if you expect to make good communications money right out the gate. That's a lot more of a stable job. God, my life would not be rewarding at all, though, if I worked in PR. My life's pretty rewarding emotionally as a journalist because when I bring a big story, it feels good. So I think it's the chicken and the egg because there have been outlets that have come in with lots of money and then folded. Yeah. And there were not, particularly on the editor side of things, less the writer, there were not good editors, capable editors to fill those roles. Yeah. Right. Like, when I look at the editing staff we have at ESPN, we have 5 editors, I believe, 6 editors on my team. Right? 5 editors on my team, right? On who do esports work. And 4 of those editors are not originally from esports. They're passionate about esports, but they're not originally from esports. They come from journalism backgrounds. So my boss, Sean, was very involved in University of Missouri's paper and then ended up doing various different things, sports journalism, etc. He came to ESPN as in a program we call the DMA, where like you do a rotational gig, where you work in 4 different departments, 3 months each for a full year, and then like at the end of the year, either you don't have a job or someone hires you because they liked you.
Yeah.
My group hired him because he did a good job when he worked with us, and he was a passionate video game guy. He liked video games, particularly Overwatch. But he's a good journalist. He's, like that's the thing. Like the writer needs to be super plugged into the specifics. The editor needs to be able to guide to like help them write better, help them plan stories, vet sources and everything else that they need to do. Like I said, I don't say that like to demean the people I work with. Like they're not originally from esports, but they're passionate about it, but they're educated in journalism. Mm-hmm. The thing that I have seen is that a lot of these outlets have come in and they've hired someone that they believe is plugged into esports, but those people don't know anything about content management and journalism. Right. And that's why ultimately a lot of these fail. A lot of these outlets fail. And then there's like, oh, well, it doesn't work. So why would we invest in it? That's the other like argument. This happened a lot actually after Yahoo Esports shut down. A lot of people are like, oh, it doesn't work. Why would we invest in it? And it's like, what did Yahoo Esports? They did some really good stuff. I mean, my colleague Emily used to work there. Kelsey Moser and Tafo, like a lot of people I have a lot of respect for. But one thing Yahoo Esports never did, unless it was given to them under embargo or like exclusive from Riot or whoever, is they never broke news. Literally ever. And news is like a huge driver of page views and traffic and interest. Like it builds your credibility. There's nothing that builds it faster than being right about news, right? Being the source for news. Like I think, but after they shut down, like a lot of bigger outlets that I know were like, oh, well, we may hold off on investing in this. But I can also say with full assurancy, right? Because there are enough outlets around or enough outlets paying attention that if someone like me came out of the woodwork and like just started breaking every big business story right now, right? Like if someone had those connections, was doing that, like they would get a job. They would be employed very quickly. It would matter of months, right? So it's kind of like which one comes first, the outlet that like props up and develops that, or is it the person that comes and then gets the job and starts something? It's a weird position. You mentioned earlier the like 5 or 6 people that were around back when I first got started. Let's go through those real quick. So Richard Lewis, who took a extended hiatus from journalism to go be a host, and has now come back and does more content creation, but occasionally does journalism. Slasher, who hasn't had a full-time journalism gig since 2016 and breaks news via Twitter. Josh Raven, who I don't even know what Josh does anymore, but at one point like ended up doing ghostwriting for players for one of those websites that does like the like player essay things in esports. And then Neil Kusingham, who worked at the Score and then became a software engineer at Dot Esports, built all their back end and now doesn't work in the industry at all. Those are the 4 people that were doing this when I was doing this. That's what they're doing today. And they were all much better than me when we started. And it was just like I wanted to beat them. I was motivated to beat every single one of them. And that was like pedal to metal, go beat these people, be better than them. That was the big thing for me. Yeah.
So that brings me to another question then. With who's your competition now? Who are you trying to beat? What's your motivation for doing the work that you do? Because you don't have competition anymore, really, do you?
Yeah, occasionally I do. If the story's big enough, it will like float up to the Washington Post or Forbes or Bloomberg or Sports Business Journal. They all have people who like do esports part of their workload. And so like occasionally I'll have a story where like I have to beat them and have they've beaten me a few times too, to be clear. But in terms of like full-time competition, there's no one. And that's like really sad. There are people like DK who are doing work in Counter-Strike, breaking news in Counter-Strike. Yeah. I don't do as much in Counter-Strike. Like League of Legends I feel like League of Legends still needs me around. So it's the majority of my work is League, I would say, and the news side of things. There's no one else trying to break that news. There have been a few people that have come along. But they didn't want to be journalists and they didn't want to write. They just like wanted to break the news and rumor monger, which is not the same thing. So yeah, it's I don't usually feel like I'm competing for a League of Legends scoop anymore. And I miss that feeling because it does motivate you a lot more to like have to beat someone else. You have to be quick and efficient, but also not wrong. And that's a very hard balance to do. I would say I got pretty good at that by the time everybody else fell off. But yeah, I do miss it a little bit. I would encourage other people to do what I do. But it's also like, again, like it takes risk. It takes a lot of risk. It takes career risk. Because it immediately closes off certain jobs. I think people are a lot more tolerant of it, but also like the question of confidentiality, even though I've never broken a source ever, like it would be hard for me to get a big time job where everything had to be secret all the time, where there was like a ton of like IP because people were just like, he was a reporter once. And it's like, yeah, even though I was like really good about like keeping what was off the record and, and protecting people, like that's not understood necessarily quite yet. So it shuts off those jobs. Like you eliminate a certain field of profession if you ever wanted to pivot. And then also like you have to like really go out of your way. It's a hard profession to excel in. It takes way more effort, I think, than most anything else in writing and just like appearing. It's much. Not saying these are easy jobs because they're not, because they take different skills in terms of analysis and everything else. But like it takes a ton of work to be like an analyst or a host or whatever it may be, but it is not the same type of work as journalism. And it is a lot more forgiving, I think, is the big thing. Like it's a lot less forgiving to be a journalist.
Mm-hmm. So what's the motivation to keep trying then? What pushes you forward every day, considering you don't have any competition anymore? Because even hearing you talk about it, you do miss it. You miss that there's like some level of and you're a very competitive person. Like even all the other stories you talk about, there was a level of competition in everything that you've done. What pushes you to keep doing things without any competition, really?
I would say I've shifted the goalposts a lot. My job is the way I view myself, and maybe this is a little arrogant. Like I view myself as one of the best journalists in esports, but that doesn't mean I'm one of the best journalists in the world. Yeah. And so like I have so much farther to grow, so much more to grow. I feel like I've grown as much as I can if I'm only evaluating myself in my bubble. Yeah. But there is room to grow and push forward this industry by like learning lessons from other places. So like I read a ton of journalism from entertainment and politics and sports and tech. That stuff is what gets me going because I see stories, and I'm working on a few of them right now. I see stories in esports that deserve that level of storytelling, and I feel like I'm one of the few people that can do it. I have the support staff to help me do it too, in terms of editors and resources and everything else. And so that makes me motivated. It's a different type of motivation. It's less competing on stories now and more so like doing good service for my industry. Like I definitely, William Turton is maybe a name people haven't heard in a while, but like similar to me, he was like a really young guy. I think he's a little bit younger than I am. But he is a really young guy who like tried to do this and then was like, I think actually Meet Your Makers was part of this too. He basically like got shamed out of the industry and then like went and worked in politics and like got a job. Worked at Daily Dot for a while in our political section, but then also like ended up working at Vice and and Bloomberg and a few other places. People maybe have not heard his name in a lot. Like I have definitely thought about walking away from journalism or from esports and doing journalism in another field where things are more competitive and that drive does exist. But at the same time, I feel like this industry needs me, and that's what like keeps me around. It's like I wake up every day going like this industry is like still in many, many ways the Wild West. You see like the sexual abuse stuff that's happening right now, particularly in like fighting games and other things. And I'm like, like who is covering this? Right. Like it's a series of like 40 twit-longers and like it's not coherent at all. Like who's covering this type of stuff? And like, I want to be like, oh, me. Right. Like I want to be that person that's like the glue that tells those stories and like ask hard questions and gets hard answers. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that makes sense. So do you think there'll come a point where you will pivot, that there's a point where you're going to stop doing esports into something else that is a bigger scope?
I don't think so. Not anymore, at least. I think what I'm doing right now, the type of work I'm doing, I think will eventually pivot. but I don't think the subject matter will pivot. I'm still really passionate about esports, but I do want to get more into producing and directing behind the camera as much as in front of the camera. Not filming myself, but in terms of like, I've worked on a few projects where I've noticed that that's like a big passion of mine, and it's a skill that is not necessarily as tapped in my current day to day right now. And so I want to do more of that. I've made that known to the leaders of ESPN, and kind of see where that takes me. But I'm still really passionate about this industry. I still think that there are tons of stories that aren't told that need to be told. How that will work, I don't know exactly, but in terms of like being passionate about doing it, yeah, that's still definitely there.
Okay. Do you see a world where journalism in esports improves? Is there a world where this happens? Because for my eyes, I don't know if it does. Right now, the only one I see is really ESPN. But I don't know if I see it ever getting better. But I'm also a pessimist, so
I think it will. You know, I
think it swaps from being your standard all-style media to more individual content creators. That's what I think it ends up being.
So I actually do agree with that. Because I think the esports audience is very similar to the basketball audience, but with content creators. What I mean by that is that the basketball audience, in terms of sports, more than any other sport, people follow individuals and cling to them, right? Like, look at LeBron James. How many people have been in the past 10 years, Miami Heat, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Los Angeles Lakers fans? They've had the full swing. And what's the common glue? Well, LeBron James has been on all three of those teams. There are people who are fans of him and fans of players. I see that with and I've had to explain this to like colleagues and all sorts of people, how important individual brands are, way more in our profession than they are elsewhere. Right. Like, yeah, when you think about a big political story, with a few exceptions of a few smaller outlets like Axios. But when you think of like a big political story that gets broken, you don't say this person wrote that story. You say the New York Times wrote that story, or you say the Washington Post wrote that story, or whatever it may be. Right. That's not the case in esports.
That's true.
I work for the biggest sports media company in the world, and I still think like some people are just like, oh, Jacob Wolf broke this. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there are people that say ESPN, but like there are also people who
they call them the wolf bombs for a reason, right?
People they actually read the byline in a way they don't for other like topics like sports and politics, right? So that's super important, and I think that you see that with Travis Gafford, you see that with Ashley Kang. Like, there are these people who are doing things with like on their own, and they're building successful businesses doing it. Like, both of those people are like, Travis does make enough income to sustain himself. And like Ashley, I think, is on path to be able to do this full time on her own as an independent content creator. Yeah. I think things like Substack and Patreon and like all these other things like allow that to happen. So yeah, I do think we're driving towards that. So I hope the part of that, right, is that if the outlet becomes eliminated for some of these people at the very beginning, and like you have ways of making income on your own, I hope that people start breaking news straight up, like just out of the blue, right? Like on their own blogs or like whatever the heck they're publishing on. This is actually, there was a site back in the day called Gold Per 10 that I remember them. Gold Per 10 actually was great about this because anyone could get paid. I remember how like privileged I felt I had like a 2 cent per page view higher CPM than everyone else because I was like a high profile creator on Gold Per 10. Yeah. I published like 2 or 3 things on there, including a news story, which did quite well. But anyway, like I miss stuff like that because that just allowed anyone to publish whatever the hell they wanted. Sometimes people abuse that. Like, I had like some parody piece written about me that was making fun of me published on that website. They're going to hit the top of Reddit, by the way. And somebody made a lot of money off of mocking me. And Gold Per 10 apologized and took it down in this whole thing. Yeah. Anyway, what I liked about that though is anyone could be a writer and they could discover themselves, because you can think you're gonna want, just like me, you can think that you want to do this thing or that thing. Yeah. You plan the career all you want in your head, but until you actually do it, you don't understand enough about yourself or enough about the subject matter until you're actually doing it. Yeah. And so I think that will, I mean, look at people like Jake Lucky.
That's what came to mind is actually
esports talk. Yeah. Like, dude just started doing it, right? Like you kind of just have to start doing it at some instances, but I hope that individual creators are becoming more enabled now than they ever have been. Because I think that will lead to some really good stuff.
So do you worry about the ethics then of it going to individual content creators? Because there's a certain level of ethics you expect from journalists. This is the thing that scares me, I think, the most about it, is I think that's where it's going. But that's the thing that like terrifies me about it, is not everyone is required to. If you're a content creator, you're not necessarily a journalist, which means you kind of don't fall underneath the same level of ethics, debatably. So it's like a really weird situation if you're a content creator and not a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, Keemstar is a pretty good example of how those ethics are often compromised. Yeah, I mean, I am worried about it blankly, right? Like are
we just screwed? Because that's what it feels like. I'm going to be real. It feels like basically it's going to go to individual content creators. We're going to get some that are really good, and then we're going to get some that are like Keemstar, and we're just screwed.
Yeah, I think in some instances, like, we are going to be screwed. But I also just think if you're like that, right? Like, you are really superficial. Like, you have an audience and yeah, you make money, but like, maybe those people are fulfilled. I don't know them well enough to like talk about Keemstar and the way he personally feels. But I can say, like, there's a level of fulfillment for me knowing that I do things by the book and people respect that. Like that respect, you have to earn that. That is earned.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, I think we'll see like drama or news breaking style stuff, but like in the end, like there's a certain amount of respect that and even like Travis has this, and I certainly don't agree with all of Travis's ethics. But like even Travis has a certain level of respect that exists between him and other people. Because he doesn't do that type of stuff. So like, I think that, to your point, like, I think it will be a mixed bag. We'll have a little bit of both. I'm not sure how much the audience will pay attention to. It depends on the audience. I think the League of Legends audience couldn't care more about the drama or style stuff. Rare instances like the whole Lena double lift hot mic situation earlier this year comes to mind, of like where people were like, "Ooh, I will dominate stream," right? Like whatever. But I think that it will be a mixed bag of both. But I generally think that there's a certain level of respect that it shows just by like who you interact with on Twitter too. And I think that people notice that.
Yeah. So one of my few last questions for you, kind of leading into that, have you ever thought about going independent yourself? Has that ever been a thought that maybe Jacob Wolf, especially considering how much esports is just associated with the name, has there ever been the thought of maybe I'll just go Jacob Wolf YouTube content or do something else, do like independent writing and stuff like that?
Yes, I've thought about it. Even recently, I've had those opportunities offered up to me in a few instances of people that would help. But my biggest thing is what I value about ESPN, is what I generally value about other outlets, is I really value being able to lean on other people more experienced than me. I think that part of journalism is, in growing in journalism, is that. And you don't get that if you're independent. You don't. Like, this is an industry where, like, good luck getting anyone to help you unless they actually work for the same place as you. Yeah, like finding mentors is really difficult in journalism. Yeah, finding people who like help you, do that and like get better at your craft is really difficult. And the easiest way to do it is to literally just work with them, right? Like they're kind of forced to work with you because you work at the same place. Like the same person writes your paychecks, right? So yes, I've thought about it, but I truly value that like level of mentorship and double checking and fact checking and all the stuff, like all the resources that come from actually being at an outlet are incredibly valuable. Far more than I think most people realize. Do I think that I could like go out and do some of my work well independently? Sure. But there are some parts of it that I definitely know I cannot, and I value that stuff a lot. So it's come across my mind, but I also like weigh it against the benefits of having a staff around you. And that's like super important to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe it. So, believe it or not, we've been here for over 2 hours. So much fun and exciting. If you didn't like it, it's too bad you've been here.
No,
but
it's good. It's good.
I've had a lot of fun. I have one last question for you. This is arguably the hardest question I will have asked you up to this point. So I hope you're prepared. Having had the experience being on this show, which I think is unlike any other interview show really out there that at least you've done, but I don't know if there's many like this one. Having had the experience being on here, if you could see anyone to be on here, and you can give me a couple names if you want, and if you mention someone who I've already had, I'll let you know. Who would you like to see on the show?
I think Monte Cristo would be fantastic.
I've gotten Monty. I've already done it.
You've done Monty. See, I think people that talk about the shows or talk on these shows are people who are like really interesting and have like deeper than surface level, right? So, this may be a little. I don't know if like an audience would be as interesting.
I don't care
in this, but
I don't care.
But I think he's a really interesting person. Nick Fan, the GM of FlyQuest, is actually like he has a really cool story. That guy is awesome. I have a certain like level of respect for him that does not exist for other people, just because like the dude's overcome a lot in his life and like has made the most of it, and is also like a really great person. So yeah, he would be somebody I think I would recommend to be on here, because I do think that he seems pretty willing to talk about some of that stuff. I know because he said some of it on Twitter too. But yeah, I think Nick would be good. He comes to mind, especially with FlyQuest being as successful as they are right now, which is topical.
Yeah, very topical. That being said, Mr. Wolf, my friend, I actually don't have any more questions for you. I've had a fun time interviewing you, and thank you for taking so much time out of your day to be on here. I'm not letting you break the record of 3 hours, because I don't ever want to do that again personally, unless I absolutely have to. That being said, if you have any shout outs or anything you want to give, you're more than welcome to give them right now. Otherwise, I will close out the show.
Yeah, shout out to my staff at ESPN, my colleagues at ESPN. This is the hardest but most fulfilling time of the year for us, in the sense that like we are about to do the World Championship, which is in a 12 for some of us, 12 to 15 hour time difference. That is not an easy lift, especially doing it mostly remote right now too, because of coronavirus. I'm super excited for that. And then like, this year has gone by, this has been a pretty terrible year for everyone, I think, because of COVID. But at the same time, like for me and for us, like it feels like we're almost through it, right? Like we've got like a month till World start, and then like Worlds, and then we're going to be in free agency planning, right? Because that's like the third week in November or whatever. And just like it's all like succinct in a row. So it's shout outs to my staff. We put in a lot of work. I'm really excited for all this like end of year content we have around Worlds and free agency. Free agency is the free agency show this year. I'm like super stoked about. I'm already getting hyped about it. It's like 2.5 months out, and I'm really excited for everything we're going to do. So yeah, shout outs to my staff. Shout outs to my lovely girlfriend and our pets. Thank you everyone on Twitter for supporting Macchiato. Because it's been a journey the past few months having a neonatal kitten. But the whole thing has been a good time. So I'm pretty content in that regard. But yeah, thank you to the audience for paying attention and supporting her.
Nice. My girlfriend loves Macchiato, and she was so happy when she found out you get to keep the cat. And I'm just like, that's awesome. But she always brings me pictures. She's like, oh, look at Macchiato. I'm like, Emily, we have our own cat. You can love our cat. We have a hairless cat, dear. Love our cat. That being said, I appreciate it. I'm happy we finally got to do this. I hope you had a good time. For everyone out there, I hope you enjoyed this interview. My name's Blake Panashevitz. This has been The Minds of Media. And until next time, I hope you guys all have a wonderful day. Bye. Oh, hello there. I hope you enjoyed this video. So make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. Shout out to all my Patreons that support me. If you're looking to support me, you can find my Patreon at patreon.com/improvblake. You can also find me streaming throughout the week at twitch.tv/improvblake.